Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Once again, this evening I am going to be focusing on how students make progress in different subjects and wider questions about how students make progress full stop. This is an ever-evolving topic, and it's going to be very interesting to dig into it this evening with Dawn Cox and Ed Bedesta. I'll just make sure that both my guests are connected up. It's going to be good, should be a really good chat. If you're listening back to this, thanks for clicking play. This is Teachers Talk Radio, the largest educational media podcast in the UK, with 1.1 million downloads and counting. And I tried to keep my shows as topical as possible. This one, I think, is quite topical because we're coming to the end of another school year. Everybody has just completed their assessments, their things they need to do at school in that regard. And I think this debate, this conversation is always worth having. It's always worth having now when we consider how students are making progress. How have they made progress? How do we know they've made progress? What does making progress mean? Is this idea of progress in itself something that we need to look at again and again? So they're the sort of questions I want to throw out there in the conversation this evening. Just before we get into that, it would be remiss of me to not mention our wonderful supporters on the show tonight. We've got John Catt Educational, who provide professional development books and resources across this profession. And you can find out more at johncattbookshop.com. You can even use JCTTR2425 to get 20% off any book that you order off the John Catt website. That's JCTTR2425. Teaching How-Tos are another supporter of our show this evening. They provide 160 visual guides to teaching techniques, as well as an online coaching platform where teachers can work together collaboratively to improve their practice. You can find out more about them at teachinghowtos.com. That's HOW2S.com, teachinghowtos.com. Reading Solutions, if you haven't come across Reading Solutions before, they offer lots of free stuff, but one of the things they did recently was a fantastic 3-day online reading conference, and they had like Michael Rosen, they had Bazit Siddiqui, they had like 20-30 different speakers, completely free to get involved in and watch back. And you can do that by going to readingsolutionsuk.co.uk and signing up for the recording. And finally, Apps for Good. If you haven't heard of Apps for Good, they provide resources mapped to the UK computing curriculum, and they offer courses that teachers can deliver, but also non-specialists can deliver to students in UK schools, mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Lots of really interesting topics. Visit appsforgood.org to find out more. I'm now going to just check in with my guest this evening. Dawn, can you hear me okay? If you want to unmute. There you go.
Hi, Tom. Good evening.
Hello. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, thanks very much for coming on. I as usual with me, it was quite a last minute thing. So thanks very much for saying yes.
Okay.
And we've also got Ed. Ed, are you there?
Yeah. Hi, Tom. How you doing?
Hello. Not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me on too. I'm very excited about this.
Do you know what, Ed? I'm quite surprised how excited you've been about this. Is there something wrong with you that you need to let everybody know? Because you seem very excited about this topic of progress in subjects in school.
Well, I think you've got a perfect storm of enthusiasm from me, Tom, because I really love radio and spoken media, and I really love talking about progress. So I might get overexcited and just start squeaking. If that happens, please forgive me.
Brilliant. Well, let's kick off with, and by the way, either of you can interrupt me at any point. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes blurb here as an introduction, right? Because a couple of years ago, things sort of, I guess, changed in the world of progress. Just for all our listeners, listening internationally. We've got lots of people who listen outside of the UK. So let me sort of outline what we're talking about here. We're talking about how students make progress in schools and in different subjects. And up until maybe 2019, 2020 sort of time, in the UK, in England, the way in which progress was measured was very much about data and about sort of how students were leaping from one data point to another. It was much more focused on that. And then in about 2018, 2019, Sean Hartford, who was involved in Ofsted, I still think he is in some capacity, but he was at that point national director, said that he defined progress as pupils knowing more and remembering more. And this is still the working definition that is used by Ofsted and the DFE today. And it's looking at viewing the school's curriculum as a progression model. So in other words, the progress of learners is evident through exploring the journey that they're taking through what should be, I suppose, a well-sequenced curriculum. And that's where the progress comes from. So the idea of what progress is has evolved, has changed, has been sort of redefined, if we like. A question I'm going to ask both of my guests, and we'll do this later, is around sort of is this a positive change? What does this look like now? What are the issues with this now? And that will be interesting to delve into. But essentially, we've shifted from a position of trying to measure progress quantitatively to trying to demonstrate progress qualitatively, is the way I guess you could look at it a little bit. But I wanted to ask Dawn first. Dawn, what do you consider, just starting right from the top, do you buy into that definition of what progress is? And do you like it, or how do you feel about what progress is?
Yeah, I think I probably do agree with that. Although, just you were saying that the changes have been made. I think there are still some schools that think that progress is tracking data. Are the numbers going up rather than down? And I think that's probably come about because obviously national curriculum levels were gotten rid of, and I think that people's understanding of kind of assessment and data and progress was sort of so limited that some people just fell back onto that kind of idea of filling in a spreadsheet. So I do think that it's more about what students can know and understand and do more, which I then think places the emphasis on curriculum and teaching rather than the assessment. And I think that's probably a good move, really. I think assessment's really, really important, but I think it's much better for us to spend time developing curriculum and looking at what high quality teaching is, because then all the assessment is just confirming that they are high quality in the first place.
What would you say were the key, because this has been in place, as we say, for a few years now, this approach, and as you say, there's still some schools who will do things in sort of the pre-2019 way. They'll still do things in that way to a great extent, but with this current way of thinking, what would you say the flaws in it are, if there are any?
Yeah, I think it kind of relies on lots of collaboration within talking about subject areas, in defining what at a subject level we mean, and that will vary between subjects. And I think one of the flaws is some school leaders want that to look the same across the school, and if you're truly going to look at a subject level, it might look differently. And I think that the strength is in schools that allow subject leads and departments to have time to kind of discuss that and develop that and define themselves what progress means. I also think that there is a bit of a gap, and Ed might have something to say to this, I'm sure, on what we mean by how much progress. Because I can say to you, okay, my students know 10 more keywords in this topic than before, but is that good? Is that enough? Should they have known 20 more keywords? What is it that they should be able to do? Yeah, they might be able to do something differently from what they could do before, but is that enough? Are they making...
But was that a flaw before, would you say, or not, because you had like target levels, target grades and all that sort of stuff? Is that...
I think now, because if you don't use numbers and data to measure progress, it becomes more tricky to define, well, what is more in being able to do things more. And I think it depends on the subject really as well, and the context is what we mean by being able to do more. You know, you could say to a student, say in my subject, as I said, you know, you might learn more keywords, but what does it mean to make sort of exceptional progress? How do you know that a child is doing kind of more than what they're kind of expected to do? And then people then rely again on data to try to turn this kind of, as you say, sort of a qualitative thing into a quantitative thing, and people want things on spreadsheets, so you end up then manipulating it to do that.
I'll bring Ed in. Ed, I've sort of outlined there what progress is seen as now, as opposed to what it was before. What are your thoughts on that? Are you happy with the way things have changed since 2019? Are you, and what is your view on any of the possible implications of it in a negative sense?
So I think Dawn has hit the nail on the head, talking about this kind of disjuncture between the different reasons we use and want to know about progress. So if you're a school leader, then you're going to need to justify your position externally outside the school. If you're a classroom teacher, if you're a recently qualified classroom teacher, you want to know if your students are understanding what you're teaching them, sometimes actually on a minute to minute basis. Actually, can I move on from this explanation? So I think one of the problems with progress is that we think it's one word that means the same thing wherever you are in the country, whatever position you've got in school. You know, whatever you want to know, you should be able to turn to something and say, well, that's progress. And as Dawn says, it often comes out as a spreadsheet. My experience in all this is that when I qualified in 2003, national curriculum levels and even sub-levels, which, you know, actually did not exist, they were just a thing that enterprising schools had made up so that they could continue to show a kind of really fine-grained level of progress. They ruled, controlled lots of things. And, you know, our lives were kind of punctuated by the need to put in another set of data. Often we ended up thinking, oh, crumbs, I've got to show a bit of progress here. So I'll add a sub-level on. So we went from A to B, maybe. And it took quite a brave person to say, yep, actually, these guys haven't made progress. I think when we got rid of national curriculum levels, the problem was that schools were left up to themselves to replace that with something. And at the same time, the pressures over accountability weren't necessarily removed. So with the one hand, the DfE was saying we're not using national curriculum levels anymore because they don't make any sense. They're kind of made up. And I completely agreed with them on that respect. But they were still saying, you've got to show progress in one form or another. You are still accountable for the data that's going on here. So I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity. Actually, there could have been a much broader conversation within the profession and within schools to find out what sort of system would help school leaders understand what was going on in their school, would help policymakers understand what value for money was being got out of the school system. And I think what replaced that was a bit of a mess, really.
What did replace that? What did replace that?
Actually, a lot of the time it was GCSE grades moved down into Key Stage 3.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you had to use GCSE style assessments moved down into Key Stage 3. And that ended up with a horror of flight paths. And I mean, as a teacher educator, which is what I was doing by the end of that decade, the 2010s, we're sometimes saying to students, why are you testing these pupils before you teach them something? And they'd say, well, because the department wants to know that we're showing progress. So I test them on something, then I teach them it, and then I test them again. Yeah, lo and behold, they know more the second test than the first. So
I mean, I'll be honest, Ed, I've done that.
Yeah,
when I was sort of teaching circa 20, I don't know, maybe 2015 or maybe a bit earlier, that sort of time, it was very much like, okay, here's the test and student gets a D, And here's another test. The same student has got a B after 6 weeks. Oh,
Absolutely.
They've made progress.
And actually, have they? And what do you mean by progress? What you're actually looking for? Now, so I think my big argument about the whole of this is that at a classroom level, progress shouldn't really be measured. It should be evaluated about the thing that you're actually teaching. So there is a role for pre-testing, actually. There is a role, but about the sort of threshold knowledge that a student needs before they step into that classroom and start that new sequence of learning, rather than the stuff you're going to teach them. You need to know what they need to know coming in. If they don't know some of that stuff, you're going to need to teach them it. As you're teaching it, and as you know, as you're drawing to the end maybe of sequences, but during the sequence as well, you're going to want to know what it is you need to see them getting better at, the kinds of behaviors, the knowledge, the things they're producing that show that they're getting better. And all of that means that the person doing the teaching and the assessing needs to really know what it is they're teaching and what they want to get out of it. And I think sometimes progress, it almost takes that power out of the hands of teachers and departments. It disenfranchises them. I mean, maybe we'll get onto this later on, but especially when you've got kind of academy trust and multi-academy trust structures which say here's a standard test that everybody's going to do, you know, that really removes things from the teacher themselves, in my view.
Yeah, we'll definitely dig into that a little bit later on. Dawn, I know that I've wanted to talk about this for a little while actually, but your post on social media really sort of inspired me to get on with it. And you posted, how do you know that students are making progress in your subject? And you asked people to talk about how they knew within their subject that students were making progress. Now, to give you a few examples on answers, Nikki, who's actually here, hello Nikki, said for RE, they know stuff they didn't know before. They can do stuff they couldn't do before. They make new links. They move from an oversimplified understanding of religious and non-religious ideas to something more nuanced. You had David Didow, who said because they know more and can do more of the stuff that we taught them. And then you had Peter, who said 60%, this is history, 60% testing, 30% questioning, 10% vibes for history. And then you got lots of answers. You got an art teacher called Lucy who said they learn how to use a new technique and then can apply it to another piece of artwork. They can experiment with ideas and techniques. They can talk about artworks using elements of art and design. I can literally see them making progress as they control materials and generate. I wanted to ask you, Dawn, number one, why did you post that? And number two, what did you think of the responses? And did they in any way sort of feed into what you were trying to get out of asking that question?
Why did I ask it? Because I like asking this sort of thing, just like Ed, and I like to hear what people have to say. There's a small group of teachers at my school, and we have kind of like weekly little teacher allowed chats, and we'd started talking about it. And I'm really interested in how this looks differently for different subjects. And I think in the past, school leaders, the kind of teaching and learning lead or the curriculum lead, there's always been this kind of everyone has to do everything the same way. And thankfully that's kind of shifted, I guess, maybe in the past 5-10 years. And I think therefore, if you want to be a school leader, but also a middle leader in a way, it's really good to understand how subjects work differently. And so if you can see how people respond differently to this question, like you can see there, you can start to understand that you can't apply the same things across the board. So I was really interested because I think that things like art, I'm probably going to get backlash on this, but it's quite easy. Like the person that replied showed 2 images and you could clearly see that child had made progress in their technique and their colours and everything. It was really visual. And I think...
Oh yeah, you're talking about the person who replied on the thread who posted a portrait that the student had created before and after, essentially.
Yes, and that was just perfect, isn't it? I mean, and that's really easy to see. And it's easy to see because, of course, they've done the same thing twice, the same task twice. I think it becomes more and more kind of subtle in depending on what subject you teach, and also depending on the context and the stage that you teach. I can't talk for primary colleagues, but I think there's probably more of that ability maybe to see the children making kind of really great strides in their learning and being able to know more and do more, maybe than, at secondary, for example. And I think it's important as subject leads that we kind of identify, well, what is it then that means that our children are making progress? What is it, at Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5? And as Ed said, it's not just pulling GCSE down to Key Stage 3. And actually, what is it that we want the students to be able to know and do? And I think it interests me because I have changed, at least for the past 10 years. I don't have schemes of work. I have schemes of learning, and I list everything I want those children to learn. And I say to my colleagues, it's up to you how you teach it. And if they're not learning it, they're not learning it. But what we're saying is the scheme is what we want them to all come out knowing. This has to be fair and across the board. You can't just have one teacher teaching one thing differently, because if we're going to use the same kind of measures, ways of measuring progress, we need to be teaching them the same things. Otherwise, kind of what's the point? So I think that's kind of changed teaching as well.
So do you not, with the schemes of work you mentioned, do you not have that sort of traditional, here's a starter, here's some tasks, here's some things, per lesson? Do you just say, here's what we want to get out of it at the end?
Yeah. And that's tricky when you have teachers with other specialisms, because teachers who are specialists, if you say, right, this is the knowledge, the content, what we want them to be able to know, do more of, then a specialist will be able to kind of transfer that with their own pedagogy and be able to teach that and teach that well. Where particularly in my subject in RE, it's much trickier to be able to do that. But that's the ideal is that making progress is that here's the list of things. It sounds quite clinical, but it's obviously not. Can the student, do they know these things, and can they do these things? It's kind of a yes or a no over time, and the methods that we're going to use to measure that, does that show us what we want it to show us? So if I look in a child's book, does that actually show me that they're making progress? And I've had many people claiming before that you can magically look in a book and see progress. Well, you can't, unless you have defined within your subject how those books are being used and what might indicate progress. So we have to be really careful with kind of applying these kind of norms across a school that, books show progress or questioning shows progress, when actually maybe they don't.
Oh yeah, I mean that's rife still, the idea of sort of digging into teaching and learning elements and saying, right, I've observed this, so therefore I'm going to make a reading on progress based on that. That I personally think that still happens quite a bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we could debate long and hard whether it should or shouldn't. I think there's about 100 flaws in it, though, in terms of that methodology and that way of doing. On an intellectual level, what you observe is very different from what might be actually happening. That's the obvious first thing, but I think there's a huge number of things there to sort of dig into. I just wondered though, Dawn, in terms of those schemes, I mean, do you, when it comes to the actual teaching that the teachers are doing, so I'll give you an example. I've just done a history curriculum at my school, and I'm very aware that there could be, or there might be, or there probably will be a non-specialist using that material. So therefore, I had to put that detail in there, that there had to be, well, it didn't have to be, but I mean, I think that I thought there should be all those sort of lesson by lesson, very sort of detailed things in there. So I know you touched on that, but how does that view of progress translate into the way you actually produce schemes of work and actually work with teachers in departments on their teaching?
Yeah, I think if you've got specialists, it's a different story if to have not non-specialists, and I'm not dismissing them at all, because I obviously teach subjects that are not my own specialism. If you have a specialist, you can then work on, obviously, if the curriculum's a high standard and you can work on that together, you can work on then teaching that. And if there are, if you want to work on what might be the best way for us to do starters or whatever it is for our subject, we can then work on that together. And we're focusing on how we're going to enact the curriculum within the classroom. It's much kind of better use of CPD time, inset time, to think about, well, how is this going to work? How are we actually going to teach this? And subject department time is always focused on, when I have my specialists with me, how can we make this better? How can we teach this? Did our students understand how, this concept? If not, how can we make it better? So I think this kind of idea really focuses CPD and what we focus on, not this kind of crystal ball gazing, I'm going to wander in your classroom and, oh, that was a good lesson. Actually, we can kind of define what it is that we think works in our subject. And it's always what we think works best. With teachers with other specialisms, I think it's really, really tricky. And I think they probably don't have enough confidence in their subject knowledge to be able to do the sorts of things that I can. And therefore, you might have to provide them with more things to do, because actually they might not be able to answer questions like I can.
Yeah, absolutely. Ed, I'll bring you in on that. First of all, any thoughts on any of that in terms of the way the idea of how students make progress translates into the day-to-day workings in a school, how it should or shouldn't?
Well, I mean, at the risk of flogging a dead horse, I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about different people within a school having different ideas and different needs arising out of the concept of progress. So, Dawn, you just brilliantly described what happens in a well-organised collegiate department that is staffed by subject specialists. You're having conversations about what does it mean to get better globally in RE, and then on a topic by topic basis, what is important about this topic, what's difficult about teaching it, and that's, I think, is very different from the needs of a school leader, but also crucially the people I work with most these days is people who are coming into teaching. And for them, that when they're thinking about progress, it is often actually minute by minute or lesson by lesson, or when they first start thinking about it, they're thinking about their own progress and did I look like a teacher? Did I manage to pass myself off as an effective professional? And then, but hopefully by the end of their training, they're noticing what progress students are making because they understand what it is they're teaching. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to bring out of what you were saying, Dawn, was this idea of subject specialism. And I think subject specialism works at loads of different levels. And you mentioned really important ones like subject knowledge, these ideas of big concepts in different subjects and how they relate to progress. But especially for new teachers, they also are a kind of source of knowledge and experience about teaching specific topics. I'm lucky because I'm a historian, and the history teaching community has got this fantastic journal, Teaching History, but there are others for other subjects as well that contain wisdom on teaching this topic or that topic, or the misconceptions around a particular process or a particular way of thinking about the world, which means that teachers have this amazing resource that can tell them or help them understand what progress is being made in a lesson. And I think one of the big problems with national curriculum levels, one of the massive problems with dragging GCSE grades is that, as I said before, it almost kind of obscures that it's like we're trying to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again, rather than really digging into our subject community. I wonder if that is actually one of the biggest problems that non-specialist teachers have. Actually, they're kind of doubly cut off, not only from their own subject, but also from that collected wisdom that other subjects have already built up. And it is one of the things that worries me sometimes about the way that people get trained in a lot of places, is that rich understanding and subject community that they're joining, they're not able sometimes in some training to get the benefit of that.
I want to sort of flip a question to both of you, and both feel free to come in on this one. I mean, when we say about working through, curriculum as the progression model, right? And students work through a curriculum from the start of the year to the end, and they do various different assessments or different, things where the teacher finds out how they're getting on. Is the fact that this idea of things being embedded into long-term memory, so the idea of it isn't really learning until it's learned, sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
So does that mean that there isn't really a model for this that is good, if that, in the sense that if a student's forgotten it all by the end of A level, what they did at Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, for example, then have they made progress in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4? If they've forgotten it all by the end of A level, in our prism of I say our, in Ofsted and the government's current prism of what making progress means, then they would have made progress at Key Stage 3 if that had been looked at in year 8 or year 9. But when it was looked at a few years later, they would not have potentially
I don't think
any progress.
It doesn't work like that, memory. And actually, the way that Ofsted and the DfE, the way that accountability mechanisms think about memory is actually really limited, and it doesn't match the much broader understanding of how memory works that cognitive scientists and psychologists have. So, but I also think it's quite a narrow way of thinking about school. You progress in school in many more ways than the contents of your memory. The contents of your memory are really important, but actually what goes into your memory isn't just the stuff you were taught. It's not just the stuff that ends up on the front of our sequences of learning. You learn all kinds of things, like your position in society and how you relate to other human beings and how important you are to teachers, and your expectations of the world, and the kinds of work or relationships you can look forward to having. What's important, what isn't important in the world. That's also the curriculum, whether it's an official one or otherwise. So for me, that is a very limited way of looking at how learning works, not least because we all forget really important stuff all the time, and then we re-remember it when it becomes important again. Your brain is not a long-term filing cabinet. It just isn't.
I mean, Ed, just to go into history for a moment, because obviously I'm a history teacher as well.
Yeah.
Just a quick question on history in terms of what do you think, what would you say is sort of, how do students make progress in history, and how should that be measured or quantified?
Well, I mean, I think history got itself in a bit of trouble towards the end of that, the period that ended with in 2013 with changes to the national curriculum, and then the changes to accountability afterwards. In that we went to global, we started to kind of swap or kind of see ideas of progress in ideas of understanding big second order concepts like change and continuity. So you got assignments in and tests in and results for your understanding of change and continuity across Key Stage 3, for instance. And we lost, I think, something much more concrete, that the idea of knowing more and being able to do more does actually seek to readdress. I don't necessarily have a huge problem with that, as long as it's not the only thing we measure. I think Christine Council, who I think must be the most quoted person on Edu Twitter by a long chalk. I can't remember where it was now, but she wrote brilliantly about the different sorts of knowledge that students have and use when they're learning history. So you have the kind of fingertip knowledge that you need, the kind of detailed stuff that when you're in the middle of an inquiry, you're right in the center of a sequence of learning and you're really, really delving into it. That fingertip knowledge you're using then might not be remembered. What's remembered is a kind of residue, which actually I wish she hadn't used that word, but she does. Sort of residual knowledge that is about the big ideas, the sense of place within a chronology, perhaps the sense of big changes and developments over time, the sense of change to kind of big ideas like parliament or democracy, or but not necessarily being able to recall a particular date at a particular time, or who led which army at the Battle of Waterloo. So I think we need to almost, give ourselves a bit of a break over this and recognise that we want students to remember things when they need it, and to be able to re-recall it or know where to look for it when they need it again.
Dawn, with regards to RE and RS, I'll just briefly ask you the same question, because I wouldn't have a clue within the RS RE world, and I'm sure my teachers taught RS colleagues will shout at me for this because I don't have a clue. What does it look like in RS then? If you were to say, right, is it the same as what Ed's just described for history, or is it completely different? What is progress in RS RE look like?
Yeah, I think there's huge similarities. My argument would be that if you've written a good curriculum, if you've got a good curriculum, then it will allow students to develop over time these kind of crucial, I know people hate the word skills, but I'll use it kind of in a general term, ways of doing things, that if they were to go on to study by themselves or in another context, they'd still be able to do it. So they might forget, I don't know, for example, Muslims go around the Kaaba 7 times, but they might remember when we study religion and belief. One thing that we might look at is how does that belief, how is that shown in everyday practice? And so they'll be able to take that concept and they'll be able to apply that at another point. So it's not that they might remember those facts at the time to be able to understand the wider concept. So we will have kind of key concepts that go through the curriculum. And my kind of goal is, if a student went off to study a worldview that we hadn't studied, they would be able to go and do that because they've learned the basics of what it means to be able to study religion or worldviews, religions, beliefs, and they could do that themselves. So they won't forget. They might forget things, I guess, but they'll remember the things that are important to be able to do that. And then if they went back and said, okay, right, how do Muslims, what practices they do when they go to Mecca? Oh yeah, they do go around the Kaaba. Oh yeah, how many times? Oh yeah, 7 times. So, 7. The facts in themselves, in a way, don't matter so much. It's what is the long-lasting learning that they will go on to use, and that will carry on even if they go obviously to degree level, postgraduate level, those kind of key concepts that make our subjects different, that they can carry on using.
I've got a provocation for both of you in a moment, but just before I go on to that, just to give a shout out to everyone listening live. If you want to get involved in this conversation, please feel free to. It would be lovely. We've got RE, RS, and history covered, but if you have another subject that you want to talk about in terms of how students make progress in your subject, for example, hit the little icon in the bottom left, little microphone icon, and join us on our little panel, and have your sort of say and share your thoughts on this idea of progress and how students make progress in your subject. It'd also be an opportunity for me to give another shout out to our supporters on the show tonight. We've got John Catt Educational, leading publishers of stuff for teachers, you teachers out there, and you can get 20% off any book on the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com, by using the code JCTTR2425. That's on any book on the John Catt website. Another one of our supporters tonight is Teaching How To's. If you haven't heard of Teaching How To's, they are an online coaching platform, 160 visual guides. Lots of schools use it to communicate between each other in terms of coaching and developing teaching and learning practice. You can check them out at teachinghowtos.com. That's HOW and the number 2s.com, teachinghowtos.com. I wanted to fire out a provocation to you both, and it sort of relates back to what I said earlier in terms of what Sean Harford said all those years ago, pupils knowing more and remembering more. Well, if progress is, I mean, we've sort of agreed on this. Like, I feel like you've both agreed on that in this conversation so far. But what I wanted to ask was, if I, as a teacher, was to teach my lessons by telling the students stories every lesson for a big chunk of the lesson, do some retrieval to sort of reinforce the story I've told them. So I'm just telling them a story. I'm telling them information. I'm quizzing them on that information. And that is going to be my teaching for the next 7 years with those students in every lesson. They could, in fact, I think they probably would make progress on the basis that Sean Harford describes, which is pupils knowing more and remembering more. There is no reason I can see why students wouldn't make progress on that measure. However, what is their experience going to be like of my lessons? What is the learning experience going to be like? What are they going to actually get out of that experience? Are they going to enjoy that experience? Does it matter if they enjoy it? Because if they've made progress as we've just described, then they've made progress. And if progress is this sort of, their attainment, their progress is that sort of pinnacle that we should be striving for, then that's fine, isn't it? My provocation to you is, am I right in saying that? Am I wrong in saying that? What does that mean? What do you think?
Well, okay, it is a provocation, but I think the first thing to say is that people don't ever actually teach like that. I remember, maybe 10 years ago now, actually maybe a little less than that, there was a big thing on Twitter with lots of people saying, just tell them. And I know that even those people weren't just telling them. That's just not the way that teaching works. It is, I know it can be a cliche, but it's a relational back and forth thing. What I would say, though, is that misses out a huge chunk of what the curriculum is and also what students are learning. I think if we go back to what you just said, Dawn, about your hope for students when they encounter something which you haven't directly taught them about, they've got a set of capabilities and ideas and skills and knowledge that they can turn to this new situation. And I think that's a really wonderful description of what you might call a disciplinary lens, which applies to all the subjects, that they're all different ways of interacting with the world, and that they all represent a kind of stock of human knowledge and experience. And people talk about the best that's been thought and said. I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think it probably leans into a way of teaching people an accepted view of the world rather than those skills. But if you're teaching them about how a discipline views the world, if you're teaching about the methods that they've got, about the sort of epistemic tools, how do they find out what's real? How do they measure and value things? You're also giving them two crucial things which just telling them can't. One is confidence, and the second is permission to do the same. So I think what really good teachers do, even the ones that think they're just telling them, is that they induct students into a way of actively looking at the world through the kind of disciplinary lens that they're bringing. And really good teaching says to students, not you can have your own view on this or you can do your own research, but you too can take part in this discipline. You too can take part in looking at the world through this set of tools and knowledge that we've built up as human beings.
But how will you know that, Ed? And does it matter whether you know that or not?
Yeah.
Because in the end, if someone says, have they made progress? And we can show that some students have made progress, does that matter?
I think so. Yeah, I think it matters for two reasons. I mean, one, you can call something progress. That doesn't necessarily make it the sort of progress that you actually want to see. I think by having the sorts of conversations about what you're teaching that Dawn's described, you're able then to have a much clearer idea of what you actually want to see as progress. So maybe we do need to create data. Maybe we do need to continue that kind of accountability. I would argue there are better ways of doing it than we've managed to find so far. But we also need to be accountable to ourselves as professionals and say, this is the change I want to see in this group of students learning this topic. This is what I want them to be able to do. This is what I know they're going to find difficult. And here are some ideas I've got for getting around those difficulties and misconceptions. Now, if you're able to do that, then the progress that you see is when you have enabled them to get over a misconception. The progress you see is when they're able to do the worked example that you've put together, which is a bit harder than the one you've just taught them. So I think it's possible to see that progress. Quite difficult to put it on a spreadsheet. You could write about it if you had the time. But I think only looking at the spreadsheet, you're missing a big trick and a big part of what it is to teach other human beings stuff.
I'm interested in what Dawn mentioned earlier about how do we know now how much progress is good? Have either of you got any thoughts on that? Because Dawn, you sort of posed that earlier, but I'm wondering if you've got any sort of answer to that, so to speak.
No. Obviously that depends on the subject. Yeah, no, over to Ed.
Well, it's a really good question. I think that's a big problem in it when you're having to say, well, French seems to have made more progress than Russian, or RE's made more progress than physics. That sort of comparison.
But that is what people say, isn't it? People, whether it be external stakeholders, like, I don't know, in a deep dive, for example, that classic of like, students in history they won't say it explicitly, make more progress than students in geography, but there is that sort of like, there is that, isn't there? That sort of language is used.
Yeah, I think so. And I think none of what I'm about, I don't know. I mean, don't tell me if I'm talking rubbish, because I'm not a classroom teacher anymore. I don't work in schools.
Like Ed, Dawn's not going to do that. She's just said she won't offer an answer to that question. So she's not going to.
Even if I am talking
rubbish,
I think somebody needs to tell me if I'm talking rubbish eventually. I think we need to find other ways of addressing teacher quality and the quality of education other than just a set of numbers and a set of results. And I actually think that the last Ofsted framework, I know it had a lot of detractors, and I've been one of them on occasion, I think was actually an attempt to try and do that. I know why we've got to have numbers, but we just need to find a different way of doing it, because sometimes making progress is students being able to take the next step. And sometimes you'll teach something and the next step comes relatively easy, and you can teach the same thing again to a slightly different group. And for some reason, it's much more difficult. So yeah, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this, but I think as a profession, all of us as educators, I think have swallowed a bit of the Kool-Aid that we all need to be held accountable at all times. And if we're not kind of feet held to the fire, preferably by numbers, then we're all going to, I don't know, turn back into lazy teachers. Which, please don't clip that bit, because I don't think teachers are lazy. I really don't. But I don't know. We need to think about quality, because a lot of the time when we use the word progress, actually what we mean is, are these teachers any good? And sometimes progress is actually not a great way to measure that. Sorry, controversy.
You have to come in now.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, I agree. I think for me, the shift is that we shouldn't worry so much about how much progress students are making, because if we're focusing on making sure our curriculum shows progression throughout in terms of what the students can know and do. I think your point, Tom, about students kind of listening to stories is kind of stopping at that they know more, and I don't think you can stop there.
What do you mean? Explain that one.
I think that progress is knowing more, understanding more, and being able to do more.
Yeah.
Whereas you're listening to stories and recalling them is knowing them. You might not have any understanding of the meaning or the concepts in the story that are important, and then that might not enable you to then analyze another story. So I think your example, why that probably wouldn't, to me, show sort of full progress in a way, is because it stops at that first point. And we tell stories all the time in RE. That is a big part of the
Yeah.
curriculum. But it's what we do with the stories and what students learn to do and how they learn to deal with stories. Again, if they were to go and read a completely random story at a different worldview, they would be able to unpick it in the same way that we had before. So I think, as Ed said, I don't think anybody would just do that. Even, students would even start making connections themselves. They'd say, oh, look, in that other story that happened, or, I think it's probably, to some extent, it would happen naturally, actually. You wouldn't just be able to stop with, let's read a story, let's read a story, let's read a story. Children would start picking up on those connections. So I think that if we spend our time on curriculum and we spend our time on subject-specific pedagogy and working on what we think works in our context for our students, that is a much better use of time than worrying about how much progress our students are making. I know that is very scary for some leaders, and it feels like a really risky strategy, because the analogy that I've heard people use before, I'm just feeding that pig and I'm rarely weighing it, and people are scared by that. But if I know that the food that I'm giving that pig is really good and I'm doing it all the time, that pig is going to get fatter. Apologies for that awful analogy, but that's what people use, in education. And I'm confident, she says, that what I'm giving the students and how they're experiencing that is good. I don't need to worry so much about if it's working. There's two caveats that I always say, is my mantra, and I say this to my head teacher and my boss. As long as the students are there, and as long as their behaviour is good for learning, they will make progress. So, and that's a bold statement, but I'm confident in my curriculum and I'm confident in my teaching for that to be the case. And I've been teaching for many, many years. That might not be so such the case with, new teachers, but they will get into that. That's the whole point of developing your teaching, so that the children make progress almost by default, because of what you're teaching and how you teach. I think.
Love that, Dawn. I absolutely love that, and that's where the leader would then respond with, "That's great, Dawn. I'm just gonna." I don't mean leave you alone in the sense of like, leave you alone if you need help with one thing or another. I mean, when it comes to like the idea of, I want to see more rapid progress, Dawn, with your student, sort of leave you alone in that regard, in the sense, right, I understand what Dawn is saying here. I understand it. I get it. And that is enough. That is, and this is a very experienced teacher talking to me. So, that's where, but I feel like, if your leader's done, and I'm presuming by you telling me that you probably have this, is to an extent understand that. I think there's a lot of people out there, I'm not going to say leaders, I'm going to say anybody within the spheres, like, no, that's not enough. We have to get every ounce of progress in every second of a lesson. Like, I put out a thing the other week saying that idea of like, oh, I spent like 3 or 4 minutes just chatting with some students at the end of a lesson or something, right? Or, oh, I did a task that wasn't, sort of like the status quo of science of learning tasks, like it wasn't the perfect science of learning task. And therefore, I wasted some time, right, in my lesson. But it's like, look at the bigger picture, look at the longer term. If the students are there, and if, and I get completely what you're saying, Dawn. I don't know what exactly I'm trying to say here, other than I'm just garbling endlessly. But what I'm saying is, I'm excited by what you've just said, and I agree with it. Ed, you can tell me what you
Come
think.
on, Ed.
Well, I agree too. It's a bit dull when everybody agrees, isn't it? I think the only thing that slightly worries me about that is the education system isn't taught by loads and loads and loads of Dawns, unfortunately. So a lot of people are
what
much
a
less.
shame.
Well, what a wonderful world it would be if, but a lot of people are much less experienced, and the teaching. I think we have the youngest teaching profession now in the G8 or in the OECD.
And there's more.
OECD developed countries.
I think there's something like, well, actually, I put this out just yesterday about how many teachers there are now without any qualifications. It's
Yes.
gone up by a
Yeah.
ridiculous amount in the last 4 or 5 years, like a ridiculous amount.
And often those teachers are teaching communities that are marginalized and disadvantaged in multiple ways. So, and often in those situations,
it's gone up. Here you go. Here's the stats. So
Right.
there are 24,000 teachers without a formal teaching qualification who work in state schools in England, an increase of more than 60% in 4 years.
Do you know what? Loads of those people would be great as well. They'd be really good at what they're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, Jesus was a pretty good teacher, Dawn, wasn't he? Considering he didn't have a PGCE.
No.
Sorry, I had to get that in there. Don't try and steal my joke. You were like going in there halfway through the sentence, go because he didn't have a PGCE.
Sorry,
but that's what I was. Yeah, it's okay. Carry on.
But I think, actually, well, if you come to learn at Leeds Trinity, then I'm sure we would have made him in the end. I think the problem with that, of course, is that the students who need that deep expertise that people like you have got, Dawn, that deep experience, that understanding, and that calm, the kind of lack of panic about rapid progress, which sometimes sounds like vapid progress to me.
I love that phrase.
It just means a spreadsheet, doesn't it? And actually, but a lot of the people in those situations don't have that to fall back on. So often they will be teaching in high control environments where it is about, you've got to do it X way, you've got to do it the trust way. There isn't any leeway around that, and progress is measured by this thing happening at the end of each term, or this thing happening at the end of each half term. So I completely agree, Dawn. For people like you who've got that level of experience, you can talk about it in those ways, and it's a really effective way of doing it. But a lot of the school system isn't like that, unfortunately.
Dawn, what's your solution to that?
I think, obviously, I think middle leaders, subject leaders are absolutely crucial. I think that they are the powerhouse of a school, and they are the people that make they can make huge differences, not dismissing anybody else's role, but really, if we're talking about progress here, we are the people that obviously work on the curriculum as part of a team, depending how it works. So if we're getting the curriculum right, and if we are working on discussing, having training on, and working on the strategies that we're going to use to enact that curriculum, even if you are a teacher who is early in your career or unqualified, we are giving that kind of structure to lead towards what we hope it's going to be. I wasn't a great teacher in my first few years of teaching. Obviously, I've got better every year. I'm not proud enough not to say, I'm a better teacher now than I was then. But we can put structures in, department structures and whole school structures to support that. And if you think about the time in the past where trainees have spent time entering data, doing silly activities to try and prove things, we just need to shift the time spent on inducting them into the curriculum so they know it really, really well, working on subject knowledge and working on our subject specific pedagogy. Then I think that's going to be really powerful. But you've got to have a specialist subject lead. And again, RE has huge issues with this, where you have got subject leads that aren't specialists, that can't do that. This a controversial point that Nikki will love. RE needs to become national curriculum so that we can get more centralised kind of ideas about what that might be. We can share our curriculums much more so that people can learn from each other, because at the moment everyone can pick everything and anything essentially. So I think you can put structures in, and good leaders will spend their time doing that and be given time to do that, so that actually it's about supporting colleagues moving towards that. Maybe that's a dream world, I'm not sure, but
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I wondered, with regards to the idea of assessment running through what you do, would you say that you have changed the way you look at assessment in the last 10 years, or would you say it's stayed broadly the same?
I think it's probably stayed the same, and I think that my view of assessment is probably not a common one. I think that assessment should just be the thing that you're doing to just check that everything is working. Is our curriculum being enacted? Is our teaching high quality? It's just a checking. It's not something to beat people with, to kind of beat students with, beat teachers with. It's something that is that checking exercise. And I think that teachers and leaders need to have a really good understanding of what we mean by assessment, the different types of assessment, how it works, and the inferences we can make, etc., etc. It's this whole big thing. I was kind of hoping that the next big thing after curriculum would become assessment, because I think as a profession we could really do with understanding how kind of that might work much more better than just kind of doing a test and, oh look, that child, as you said earlier, they did get a D and now they've got a B. Well, that means absolutely nothing. I think we need to again have training, support, a big push on assessment, but with this focus on that it is testing whether your curriculum and your teaching is doing what it should be doing.
Ed, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really sorry again. I completely agree. About 10 years ago, the SSAT brought out a really good CD-ROM